Pain was a familiar companion, but Spectre barely acknowledged it. The cold metal cuffs around his wrists dug into his skin, the dull ache blending with the bruises beneath his shirt. He sat motionless in the dimly lit cargo hold of the slaver vessel, surrounded by the guttural laughter of his captors. The ship thrummed with life, its pulse a distant vibration beneath his boots. Outside the reinforced cell bars, reptilian slavers, hulking figures covered in overlapping plates of iridescent armor, conversed in their rasping tongue. Their leader, a brute named Commander Vorkesh, loomed over him with an amused sneer. "You humans break so easily," Vorkesh rumbled, his talons flexing against the hilt of an ornate energy blade. "A few strikes, a little pressure, and you crumble. I expected more from a species desperate to prove itself." Spectre exhaled slowly, letting his gaze drift up. His expression was unreadable, detached. "Funny," he mused, rolling his shoulders as if testing the weight of his restraints. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're the one making a mistake." Vorkesh's slit pupils narrowed, but amusement flickered in his eyes. He let out a gravelly chuckle. "A mistake? I think not. You are nothing but property now, human. Tomorrow, you'll be auctioned off like the rest of your kind. The markets pay well for rare specimens, and you—" His voice dropped to a mocking whisper. "You look particularly fragile." One of the slavers, a younger one, Keldra, if Spectre recalled correctly, shifted uneasily at the words. Her armored tail twitched, her gaze flicking toward Spectre, then back to her commander. She was the only one who hadn't struck him during his capture, the only one whose stance lacked open cruelty. Spectre didn't respond to Vorkesh's taunt. He didn't need to. Instead, he closed his eyes for a beat, inhaling the metallic tang of the ship's recycled air. He had already mapped out the room's exits, the guard rotations, the hidden compartments in the walls. Every breath brought new data. Every second of stillness was another step toward control. And then the moment came. A burst of static crackled over the ship's comms, interrupting the slaver's laughter. The deep voice of a bridge officer cut through. "Commander, we intercepted a distress beacon near the human's last known location." Vorkesh barely turned his head. "Irrelevant. Human fleets are slow to respond. We will be gone long before they arrive." A pause. Then, hesitation from the officer. "Sir, it's not just a distress call. It contains a name." The air in the room shifted. "Speak." Vorkesh's voice lost its mirth. The officer hesitated, then the word came through the speakers. "Spectre." Silence gripped the hold. One of the slavers, a scarred brute who had been grinning moments before, stiffened. Another let out a soft, involuntary hiss. Vorkesh's expression didn't change. "And—" The officer cleared his throat, the tremor in his voice barely concealed. "Permission to transmit this to command, sir. If this is that Spectre, we—" "You are trembling like a hatchling." Vorkesh's voice was sharp, dismissive. "Spectre is nothing but a man. A captured man." He turned his gaze back to the prisoner. "Tell me, human, is this name meant to frighten me?" Spectre finally opened his eyes. The smallest hint of a smirk touched his bruised lip. He tilted his head, meeting Vorkesh's gaze with a quiet, unsettling confidence. "Not yet." The words were soft, measured, and yet, they carried the weight of something far greater than bravado. A visible ripple of unease passed through the slavers. Vorkesh clicked his mandibles in annoyance. He motioned to a nearby guard. "Remove this fool from my sight. I will not entertain his arrogance." The guard hesitated. Only a fraction of a second, but Spectre caught it. So did Vorkesh. The commander's amusement flickered into irritation. He stepped closer, towering over Spectre, and gripped his jaw with one clawed hand. "You are nothing," he growled, tightening his grip. "Your name means nothing." Spectre held his gaze. "Then why are your men afraid?" Vorkesh released him with a sharp jerk, stepping back. "They are weak-minded fools." His voice betrayed no fear, but the room itself told another story. The laughter was gone. The easy arrogance had withered. and Spectre had done nothing but speak. The tension lingered for a moment longer before Vorkesh turned on his heel, motioning for his warriors to follow. "Prepare for departure," he ordered. "Set a course for the markets. I want this cargo delivered without delay." As the slavers filed out, only Keldra hesitated, her eyes flicking between Spectre and her commander's retreating form. For the first time, she looked at him not as a captive, but as something else. Something unknown. The door sealed behind them, leaving Spectre alone in the cell. He exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders again. The bruises, the cuffs, the taunts, none of it mattered. He leaned back against the cold metal wall, tilting his head up to the dim lights. It had begun. Vorkesh thought himself in control. The slavers believed that chains held him. They hadn't realized the truth yet. Spectre was never a prisoner. He was the executioner waiting for the right moment to strike. And now, the moment was coming. Spectre sat motionless in his cell, the hum of the ship's engines vibrating through the walls, a constant reminder of his captivity. The slavers had grown silent since the transmission. No one had come to taunt him, no one had even bothered to check on him. In the span of a few moments, the atmosphere aboard the ship had shifted, like a storm rolling in over an empty sea. He didn't need to see it to know what was happening. They were scared. Despite his position, Spectre felt the stirrings of a dark, quiet satisfaction. Fear was an enemy the slavers had never truly considered. Humans didn't just fight, they endured. And that endurance had earned him a reputation far beyond his years, far beyond what anyone, even the Slavers themselves, had ever anticipated. A soft hiss from the airlock door snapped him from his thoughts. The door slid open with an eerie groan. Spectre's eyes flicked up. There she was. Keldra. She stepped inside, her gaze darting around nervously before fixing on him. She wasn't in her usual stance, no longer just a soldier following orders. There was uncertainty in her eyes now. "You're not like them," she said quietly, her voice soft, almost hesitant. Spectre said nothing, allowing the silence to fill the space between them. It wasn't fear he saw in her eyes, not yet, anyway, but something darker. A quiet realization. After a moment, Keldra broke the stillness. "I didn't think it was true. The stories about you. But now, I'm not so sure." Spectre leaned forward, his chains scraping the cold floor, and met her gaze. "You should be," he replied, his voice low but steady. "And you should be afraid." She flinched at the words, and for a moment, she looked like she might turn and leave. But something held her there, something Spectre couldn't quite place. Her shoulders were tense, her claws twitching nervously at her sides, but she didn't move. "What will you do?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. "What happens if they find out who you really are?" Spectre tilted his head, his expression unreadable. "What do you think?" Keldra hesitated, glancing over her shoulder as though to ensure no one had overheard. "You don't look like them. You don't act like them. What if you had a chance to go free?" The offer hung in the air between them, its weight heavier than the metal walls surrounding them. "You think you can just let me go?" Spectre's voice was cutting, but not unkind. He wasn't angry, just practical. The situation was clear. Keldra had been raised among these creatures, believing their superiority. She couldn't see the truth just yet. "I'm not the one who can make that decision," she said quickly, her tail flicking nervously. "But they are starting to question you. You're not who they thought you were. I think they're scared of you. Maybe they'll stop dragging you to the markets." Spectre's lips curled into a thin smile, but it was cold, calculating. "If they're afraid of me now, they won't be once I'm out of here." He paused, then added, "But you're wrong if you think they'll let me go. They'll kill me the moment they're sure I'm a threat." Keldra recoiled slightly, her eyes widening. "They wouldn't." They would," Spectre interrupted, his voice firm, the shadow of experience clouding his words. "You have no idea what they are capable of." Keldra swallowed hard, her confidence faltering. She hesitated again, her gaze flickering to the door as though she might leave, but something inside her kept her rooted to the spot. "What if I could help you escape?" she asked quietly. Spectre studied her, his mind running the calculations. A soft hum from the control panel outside the cell told him time was running out. The slavers wouldn't remain oblivious forever. The fear of the human assassin, his name, his reputation, would spread like wildfire among them. That's when they would make their move. He needed to act before they realized what they were really dealing with. Helping me means crossing a line, Keldra, Spectre said, leaning forward. His eyes locked onto hers with a force that made her take a step back. And once you cross it, there's no going back. Are you prepared for that? Keldra's jaw clenched, her face hardening into resolve. I'm already standing here, aren't I? Besides, what's the alternative? Let them keep you? Let them sell you? You're a human, a weapon they can't control. They'll exploit you until you're nothing. Spectre's gaze softened for a fraction of a second, but only just. His voice lowered again, carrying the weight of someone who had seen too much of war, too much destruction. I'm not a weapon, he said, his voice rough, but steady. I'm the end of a weapon, Keldra. And when they realize that, it'll be too late. She was silent for a long moment, her mind turning over his words. Then, with a final, steady breath, she nodded. I'll help you. Good, Spectre murmured. Now listen closely. You need to get to the armory. The guard rotation changes in 15 minutes. That's when I make my move. Her eyes widened, and she took a half step forward, lowering her voice. You're going to. No more talking. Go. Before Keldra could respond, the door to the brig hissed open again. She froze, eyes wide, then took one last look at Spectre before slipping out into the hallway. Spectre leaned back against the cold wall, the clink of his chains a muted accompaniment to his racing thoughts. The moment of reckoning had come. The ship's interior thrummed beneath Spectre's boots, the hum of the engines a constant reminder that time was running out. Keldra's words echoed in his mind as he prepared himself. This was the moment. There was no turning back now. His chains, the ones that had once shackled him, now felt irrelevant. He had endured worse. Much worse. The slavers had underestimated him, and that was their mistake. It was a mistake they wouldn't survive. Spectre flexed his wrists, testing the restraints. Keldra would be making her move, but even if she failed, he had other options. The ship's systems were fragile, and Spectre knew exactly where to strike. His mind ticked through a dozen plans in an instant, each more lethal than the last. Minutes dragged on, each second a countdown to chaos. Then, the door to the brig opened again, and Spectre straightened, his mind sharpening. The guard entered, a heavyset slaver, one of the more experienced crew members. His reptilian eyes gleamed with a mixture of boredom and smugness. He barely glanced at Spectre, his tail flicking lazily as he approached the cell. "You're still here," the guard growled, his voice thick with disdain. "I thought you'd have cracked by now. You humans always do." Spectre didn't answer. Instead, he let his eyes flicker briefly to the door, calculating. This guard was a distraction. A minor hurdle. He had bigger plans, much bigger. The guard shuffled closer, unlocking the cell door with a clang. "Just come on out. Your new owners will want to." Before he could finish, Spectre moved. The chains that had once restricted him became instruments of destruction. With a swift, practiced motion, Spectre yanked the guard toward him, using the leverage of his restraints to pull the slaver into a brutal knee to the stomach. The guard staggered back, gasping for air, but Spectre didn't give him time to recover. With a quick, fluid motion, Spectre grabbed the guard's throat and twisted, using the guard's own weight against him. There was a sickening crack as the slaver's neck snapped. Spectre dropped the lifeless body to the floor and stepped out of the cell, his boots making a soft thud as they hit the cold metal floor. He surveyed the hallway, dimly lit, but the slaver's footsteps echoed through the corridor, signaling the approach of others. He couldn't afford to wait. He moved fast, silent as a shadow. His hand slid into his vest, retrieving a small, concealed blade. The cold metal felt familiar in his grip. This wasn't his first time in hostile territory, but it always felt like the first. The adrenaline surged through his veins as he rounded the corner, heart steady, breathing controlled. Keldra had done her part. Now it was time for him to do his. The slaver ship's control center was ahead. Spectre could already feel the subtle hum of its power systems vibrating through the walls. The command deck was heavily guarded, but that was no issue. The trick was to make them think they had control until it was too late. He moved swiftly, down another hallway, past several more guards, each one oblivious to the storm approaching. Spectre's mind raced with calculations, each step bringing him closer to the heart of the ship. Meanwhile, Keldra was on the bridge, her heart pounding in her chest. She had been given a single chance to prove herself, and she wasn't about to waste it. The slavers around her were still distracted by the approaching chaos, their arrogance blinding them to the rising danger. She took a deep breath, steadying her hands as she slipped into the control room. Her eyes met those of a younger slaver who sat at the console. He looked up, startled to see her. She was no longer in uniform, no longer one of them. She had donned a dark cloak she had stolen from one of the higher-ranking officers. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice trembling with uncertainty. "I'm here to end this," Keldra replied, her voice low but firm. The young slaver's eyes widened in confusion, but before he could react, Keldra lunged, her claws flashing in the dim light. The slaver never had a chance. She didn't hesitate as his body crumpled to the floor. Her hand quickly found the control panel, bypassing the security codes with practiced ease. It wasn't her first time working with advanced technology. She'd learned the basics, just enough to disrupt systems when necessary. Behind her, the ship's comms crackled to life. It was Vorkesh's voice, demanding updates. The tension in his voice was palpable. Keldra didn't answer. Instead, she keyed in the command to lock down the ship's main reactor, initiating the emergency override. The ship's power systems started to fluctuate. On the other side of the vessel, Spectre felt the vibrations shift. The lights dimmed for a split second. The slavers had noticed. It was time. Spectre pushed forward, his movements precise and deliberate. He reached the control room at last, where the remaining slavers stood, preparing for whatever chaos they assumed would follow. They were wrong. Spectre threw open the door with a sharp movement, catching the first slaver by surprise. He didn't give them time to react. The blade flashed again, cutting through the air in a blur of lethal precision. The first slaver fell with a muffled cry. The others scrambled, too slow. Spectre moved through them like a force of nature, his strikes surgical, his movements deadly. He knew exactly where to hit, exactly how to disable them without wasting time. Keldra's signal had been received. The ship's main reactor was in lockdown, and the slavers were now stranded. Vorkesh's voice came through the comms once more, this time full of panic. "Report. What's happening?" Spectre smiled, his grip tightening around the throat of the last remaining guard. "You're already dead," he whispered. With one swift motion, the guard fell silent. Spectre turned his attention to the command chair. There, in the center of the room, was the control panel that would bring the ship to its knees. One final push, and he would have them. The ship was plunged into darkness as Spectre reached the control room, the emergency lights flickering to life. Power was unstable, exactly as he'd hoped. He'd initiated the shutdown sequence, overriding the systems just long enough to create chaos among the slaver crew. The air around him was thick with tension, a charged silence hanging as the remaining slavers scrambled to maintain control. His every move was calculated, a fluid dance of purpose and precision. The reactor was locked down, but Spectre knew that wasn't enough. The slavers needed to be reminded of something they had long since forgotten, the resilience of humanity. He approached the central terminal. Behind him, the few remaining guards were slowly regaining their bearings, weapons drawn, eyes wild with confusion. "Where is Commander Vorkesh?" one of the slavers demanded, their voice shaking. Spectre didn't answer. Instead, he tapped into the ship's internal comm system, overriding their transmissions. His voice cut through the ship's chaos like a knife. "The end has come," he said, his tone calm, almost measured. "Your reign is over." Keldra stood at the far end of the ship, the flicker of emergency lights casting long shadows across her face. The bridge was a maze of panic as the slavers scrambled to regain control of the ship's failing systems. But she wasn't concerned with the ship anymore. She had made her choice, and now, there was no going back. Behind her, the slaver who had been her mentor, and whom she had once trusted, now lay unconscious in the hallway. She didn't feel a single pang of regret. Her loyalty had shifted, and it had shifted fast. The truth had been too clear to ignore. "Spectre," she muttered, taking a step toward the comm panel, her fingers trembling. She had initiated the lockdown as instructed, but now she had a different task ahead. The ship was on the brink, and she knew exactly how far she could push it. As the panic on the ship escalated, so did Keldra's resolve. She approached the terminal, ready to make the final adjustment that would send the slavers into utter chaos. Spectre's gaze flicked to the terminal. The ship was alive with the sounds of alarms and confused voices, the once steady hum of the engines now a frenzied roar. He had to act before Vokesh and the other slavers could regroup. He looked up just in time to see a slaver burst into the room, his weapon raised. The guard didn't even have time to react as Spectre threw a knife, the sharp steel cutting through the air and embedding itself into the slaver's chest. He fell with a thud, the weapon slipping from his hand. Spectre didn't pause to watch the body fall. He stepped over it, moving with deadly intent toward the central control console. The sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway, more slavers. Their panic was palpable, their desperation evident. But it was too late. Spectre activated the terminal, his fingers flying over the keys. The ship's remaining systems began to flicker, the emergency protocols locking the slavers out of their own vessel. It wasn't enough to simply disable them. Spectre had to break them entirely. A voice crackled over the comms. "Who is this?" Vokesh's voice was seething with fury. "You think you can take control of my ship?" Spectre smiled, leaning back in the chair, his fingers resting lightly on the controls. "Your ship? It's mine now." He pressed a final key. The whole ship shuddered as the emergency thrusters kicked in, sending the vessel off course. Alarms screamed, lights flashed wildly, and the ship lurched under the strain of the failing systems. The slavers, completely unprepared for this level of disruption, began scrambling, desperate to regain control. But it was too late. The ship was a ticking time bomb. Meanwhile, Keldra had entered the control room, her heart racing. She had followed Spectre's instructions to the letter, overriding the last few lockouts. As she approached the terminal, she could hear the slavers' frantic footsteps closing in. She had no more time to waste. Behind her, a slaver approached, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. "Keldra," he barked. "What are you doing here?" She turned slowly, her voice cold. "I'm ending this." Before he could react, she drew the blaster she'd stolen earlier and fired. The slaver crumpled to the ground, a stunned look on his face as he fell. There was no hesitation in her actions anymore. She had made her choice, and she would live with it. Turning back to the terminal, she keyed in the last command, a signal to send the ship's trajectory off course, into a location where it would be impossible for any of the slavers to follow. As Spectre watched the chaos unfold, he could hear Vokesh's frantic orders echoing through the comms. The commander had no idea how to handle the situation. The slavers were in full retreat, and the ship was out of control. Spectre's hand hovered over the console for a moment, and then, with a single keystroke, he sent the ship into a deep, irreversible spin, locking in its trajectory. It was a simple calculation, but it would ensure the slavers were stranded, unable to reach their destination. He leaned back, watching as the ship's control systems shut down one by one. Vokesh's voice cut in again, full of fear and disbelief. "What have you done? You can't." The transmission was cut off abruptly. Spectre stood, his expression unreadable. He didn't need to hear any more. The slavers had been defeated, not through strength, but through the one thing they had underestimated, human ingenuity and resolve. Behind him, Keldra stood in the doorway, her eyes meeting his. The tension between them was palpable. She had done her part. Spectre had done his. Together, they had brought down an empire.